Cole Mitchell gripped his boarding pass with calloused hands, the paper trembling slightly as Flight 447 prepared for takeoff. Around him, passengers settled into their seats, unaware that the quiet man in 12C had once been called by a different name, one that made F-16 pilots snap to attention. Through the small window, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. 2 fighter jets escorting their commercial airliner, the pilots' helmets turning toward his exact seat. The radio crackled from the cockpit ahead, and Cole heard a voice he hadn't heard in 8 years whisper a single word that changed everything. Phoenix. What happens when a hero tries to disappear, but the sky refuses to forget him? The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 in the morning, piercing through the thin walls of the cramped 2-bedroom apartment. Cole Mitchell's hand shot out from under the covers, silencing the noise before it could wake his 8-year-old son sleeping in the next room. Outside the window, the Denver skyline was still shrouded in darkness, streetlights casting long shadows across the empty parking lot below. He padded quietly to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding him through the morning routine he'd perfected over the past 3 years. Coffee first, the cheap instant kind that dissolved into bitter brown water but contained enough caffeine to get him through another 12-hour shift at Peterson's Auto Repair. The familiar ache in his lower back protested as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, a reminder of years spent crawling under cars and lifting heavy parts. "Dad?" Tommy's sleepy voice drifted from the hallway, followed by the soft shuffle of small feet. "You're up early again." Cole turned to see his son standing in the doorway, brown hair sticking up at impossible angles, clutching the worn stuffed airplane they'd bought at a garage sale 2 summers ago. The sight of that toy always did something strange to Cole's chest, a tightening sensation he'd learned to ignore. "Big day at work, buddy. But I'll be home for dinner, just like always." Tommy rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so innocent it made Cole's throat constrict. "Can we work on my science project tonight? Mrs. Henderson says it's due Friday." "Of course we can." Cole ruffled his son's hair, careful to keep his voice steady. "What's the project about again?" "Aerodynamics. How airplanes stay in the sky." Tommy's voice carried that particular note of hope that children possessed, the unwavering belief that their parents could fix anything, solve any problem, make everything right with the world. Each conversation about flying was a small knife to Cole's heart, reminding him of dreams he'd buried so deep he sometimes forgot they'd ever existed. The morning continued its predictable rhythm. Shower in the cramped bathroom where the hot water lasted exactly 7 minutes. Uniform that smelled perpetually of motor oil despite his best efforts with cheap laundry detergent. Toast and coffee consumed while standing at the kitchen counter, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. As they walked to the bus stop, Tommy's hand found Cole's, small fingers intertwining with calloused ones. "Dad, can I ask you something?" The question hung in the crisp morning air, visible as small puffs of breath. "Why don't you ever talk about before I was born? Like, what did you do for work and stuff?" Cole felt his step falter almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the first time Tommy had asked, and each inquiry felt like walking through a minefield. How do you explain to your child that you once lived a completely different life? That you once had a different name, different responsibilities, different dreams? "I was just a guy trying to figure things out, buddy. Just like everyone else. The important stuff started when you showed up." Tommy seemed to accept this answer, as he always did. But Cole caught the flicker of curiosity in his son's eyes that never quite disappeared. The school bus rounded the corner with its familiar wheeze of air brakes and diesel exhaust. Tommy climbed the steps with his backpack bouncing, turning to wave through the smudged window as the bus pulled away. At Peterson's Auto Repair, Frank Peterson was already waiting with a coffee-stained mug in one hand and a clipboard in the other. The older man had taken a chance on Cole 3 years ago when he'd shown up with questionable references and a desperate need for steady work. Frank never pried, never asked why someone with Cole's obvious mechanical aptitude was willing to work for $15 an hour. "Got a full schedule today," Frank announced, his Boston accent thick as molasses. "That blue Honda needs a complete brake job, and Mrs. Patterson's bringing in her Buick for the transmission work we quoted last week." He paused, studying Cole with shrewd eyes. "You doing okay, Mitchell? You look like you haven't been sleeping again." "Just tired. Tommy had a nightmare last night." It wasn't entirely a lie. Tommy did have nightmares sometimes, usually about planes crashing or fathers who didn't come home. Cole tried not to think about where those particular fears might have originated. The morning passed in a blur of oil changes and diagnostic tests, the familiar rhythm of manual labor providing a buffer against the thoughts that always lurked at the edges of his consciousness. It was nearly noon when Frank appeared at his elbow, holding a phone with an expression Cole had never seen before, part confusion, part something that might have been awe. "There's a call for you," Frank said quietly. "Guy says he's from the Pentagon. Says it's about some kind of ceremony or award thing. I told him he probably had the wrong number, but he asked specifically for Cole Mitchell, who used to go by." Frank's voice trailed off, uncertainty creeping into his words. Cole's hands stilled on the wrench he'd been holding. The familiar weight of it suddenly felt foreign, like an artifact from someone else's life. What name did he ask for? "Phoenix." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. He asked for someone called Phoenix. The wrench slipped from Cole's fingers, clattering against the concrete floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. For a moment, the garage fell completely silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the soft tick of cooling engines. Cole's vision tunneled, and suddenly he was 28 years old again, strapped into the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, feeling the familiar weight of his helmet and the electric anticipation that came before every mission. Phoenix. He hadn't heard that call sign in 8 years, hadn't allowed himself to even think it. To everyone at Peterson's Auto Repair, to Tommy's teachers, to the landlord and the grocery store clerks and everyone else in his carefully constructed civilian life, he was just Cole Mitchell, single father and mechanic. But once upon a time, in what felt like a different universe entirely, he'd been Captain Cole Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. "Tell him," Cole's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Tell him Cole Mitchell doesn't exist anymore." But even as he said the words, Cole knew it was too late. The past had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran or how well you hid. Frank hesitated, the phone still in his hand. "He says it's about some kind of memorial service. Says you saved a lot of lives once and they want to honor that. He also said something about a flight to Washington, D.C. if you're willing to come." Washington. The word hit Cole like a physical blow. He'd sworn he'd never go back there, never set foot in that world again. That life belonged to someone else, someone who'd made different choices and lived with different consequences. But as he stood there in the grease-stained garage, surrounded by the honest smell of motor oil and working man's sweat, Cole felt the careful walls he'd built around his new life beginning to crack. 3 days later, Cole found himself clutching a boarding pass with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since he'd made the decision to accept the Pentagon's invitation. Tommy had been so excited when he'd told him about the business trip, chattering endlessly about airplanes and asking if his dad would get to see any fighter jets. Cole had smiled and deflected, promising to bring back pictures while his stomach churned with anxiety and something dangerously close to anticipation. The Denver airport was busier than he'd expected for a Tuesday morning, filled with business travelers and families heading off on vacation. Cole felt conspicuously out of place in his only decent suit, a charcoal grey number he'd bought second-hand for Tommy's school presentations. The fabric was slightly too loose in the shoulders and too short in the sleeves, but it was the best he could manage on a mechanic's salary. As he made his way through security, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake. He'd built a good life for himself and Tommy, a quiet life where the past stayed buried and the future was measured in soccer games and parent-teacher conferences rather than mission briefings and flight schedules. Why risk all of that for a ceremony that would honor someone he'd stopped being a long time ago? The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom as Cole settled into his seat, announcing their route to Washington and estimated arrival time. Around him, passengers stowed their carry-on bags and prepared for takeoff with the casual indifference of people for whom flying was routine. Unremarkable. Cole envied them their peace of mind, their ability to trust in the laws of physics and the competence of strangers to keep them safe, 30,000 feet above the ground. He was reaching for his seatbelt when the pilot's voice came over the speakers again, this time with a note of curiosity that made Cole's blood turn to ice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have what appears to be an unusual escort joining us today. Air traffic control has informed us that we'll be accompanied by military aircraft as part of a training exercise. Please don't be alarmed if you see fighter jets outside your windows." Cole's hand froze halfway to the buckle. Military escort. Fighter jets. The words echoed in his head like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Slowly, almost against his will, he turned to look out the small oval window beside his seat. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons flanked their commercial airliner, their sleek forms cutting through the sky with a grace and power that took Cole's breath away. Even from a distance, he could see the pilots in their cockpits, helmets gleaming in the afternoon sun. And then, impossibly, one of them turned to look directly at the passenger window where Cole sat frozen in his seat. The radio in the cockpit ahead crackled to life, and through the thin door separating the passenger cabin from the flight deck, Cole heard a voice he recognized from 1,000 training exercises and combat missions, clear, professional, and utterly familiar. "Commercial Flight 447, this is Major Rebecca Stevens, call sign Hawk. We're here to escort a very special passenger to his destination. Tell Phoenix that the sky never forgets its own." The words hit Cole like a lightning strike. Rebecca Stevens, Hawk. She'd been a lieutenant when he'd known her, fresh out of the academy with more raw talent than anyone had a right to possess. They'd flown together on dozens of missions, had each other's backs in situations where trust was literally a matter of life and death. And now she was out there, 30,000 feet above the earth, using his old call sign like it was yesterday instead of 8 years ago. Around him, passengers were beginning to notice the unusual situation. Heads turned toward the windows, phones came out to capture pictures of the fighter jets, and a low murmur of excitement filled the cabin. But Cole barely heard any of it. His entire focus was on the F-16 outside his window and the pilot who had just shattered 8 years of carefully maintained anonymity with 6 simple words. The memories came flooding back then, unstoppable as an avalanche. The weight of his flight suit, the familiar cockpit displays of his F-16, the radio chatter that had been as natural as breathing, the mission briefings and pre-flight checks, the adrenaline rush of afterburner ignition, and the peaceful silence of high-altitude flight. The brotherhood of pilots who trusted each other with their lives on a daily basis, bound together by shared danger and mutual respect. And then the darker memories, the mission that had gone wrong, the split-second decision that had saved lives but ended his career, the months of medical leave and psychological evaluation that had followed. The moment when he'd realized that his old life was over and he'd have to build a new one from scratch. The radio crackled again, and this time Cole could hear it clearly through the cockpit door. "Phoenix, this is Hawk. If you can hear this, I want you to know that what you did 8 years ago hasn't been forgotten. The families of those 200 passengers still talk about the pilot who brought their plane home when everyone else said it was impossible. They named a scholarship after you at the academy. Thought you should know." 200 passengers. Cole's throat constricted as the numbers hit him like a physical blow. He'd tried so hard to forget the specifics, to bury the details of that day under layers of ordinary civilian life. But Rebecca's words brought it all back with crystal clarity. The commercial airliner in distress, the catastrophic engine failure that had left it completely without power, the desperate radio calls for any available military aircraft to attempt a rescue. Cole had been returning from a routine training mission when the call came through. Air traffic control needed someone to try shepherding the disabled aircraft to the nearest airfield, using the wake turbulence from military jets to provide just enough lift to keep the civilian plane airborne. It was a technique that existed more in theory than practice, something they'd studied in advanced flight school but never actually attempted with live passengers at stake. He'd volunteered without hesitation, breaking formation with his wingman and racing toward the coordinates where 200 people were falling out of the sky in a metal tube with no engine power. For 47 minutes, Cole had flown beneath and beside that crippled airliner, using every skill he'd ever learned and several he'd improvised on the spot to keep it aloft long enough to reach the emergency runway at Peterson Air Force Base. It had worked. All 200 passengers had survived, along with the crew. The newspapers had called it a miracle of modern aviation, and the Air Force had decorated Cole with enough medals to fill a display case. But they'd also quietly recommended that he take extended leave to recover from the psychological trauma of the event. And somewhere during those long months of therapy and evaluation, Cole had realized that he couldn't go back to a job where other people's lives hung in the balance of his split-second decisions. So he'd resigned his commission, changed his life completely, and tried to become someone else. Someone ordinary, unremarkable, safe. Someone who fixed cars instead of flying aircraft, worth more than most people's houses. Someone whose biggest responsibility was making sure Tommy's homework got done and his soccer uniform stayed clean. The F-16 stayed with them all the way to Washington, a constant reminder that the past was never truly buried, only temporarily covered by new routines and different dreams. As the plane began its descent toward Reagan National Airport, Cole caught sight of the familiar landmarks below: the Pentagon, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome gleaming white in the afternoon sun. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special request from Air Traffic Control," the pilot announced over the intercom. "We need passenger Cole Mitchell to remain in his seat until all other passengers have deplaned. There will be an escort waiting to assist with his departure." 300 pairs of eyes turned toward Cole's seat. He felt heat rise in his cheeks as whispers rippled through the cabin, passengers speculating about who he was and what could possibly warrant such unusual treatment. A businessman in the seat across the aisle leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. "You some kind of VIP or something?" Cole managed a weak smile. "Just a guy who used to have a different job." The ceremony was held in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, a space Cole remembered from his days as an active duty officer. The walls were lined with portraits of Medal of Honor recipients, men and women who had gone above and beyond the call of duty in service to their country. Standing in that room again, surrounded by reminders of sacrifice and valor, Cole felt the weight of his own choices settling on his shoulders like a familiar flight suit. General Patricia Hayes, now the Air Force Chief of Staff, stood at the podium with Cole's old squadron patch displayed on the screen behind her. She'd been a colonel when Cole had known her, tough as nails and twice as smart as anyone else in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to honor a pilot whose actions 8 years ago saved 200 civilian lives and reminded us all why we wear this uniform." The room was filled with military personnel, Pentagon officials and civilians Cole didn't recognize. But near the front, he spotted several faces that made his throat constrict with emotion. The flight crew from the disabled airliner, now 8 years older, but unmistakably the same people he'd helped bring safely to the ground. Captain Cole Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, exemplified the very best of Air Force values when he risked his own life to guide a disabled airliner to safety, using techniques that existed only in theory. General Hayes continued. The passengers on that flight went home to their families because one pilot refused to accept that some rescues are impossible. The ceremony continued with testimonials from the rescued passengers and crew, each story a reminder of the ripple effects that single moment of decision had created. A businessman talked about the daughter's wedding he'd been able to attend. A grandmother described meeting grandchildren who wouldn't have existed if that plane had gone down. A young mother showed a picture of the son she'd been carrying at the time, now 8 years old and playing Little League baseball. 8 years old, the same age as Tommy. "And now," General Hayes announced, "I'd like to ask Captain Mitchell to come forward to receive the Air Force Cross, the service's second highest honor for extraordinary heroism." Cole walked to the podium on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of every eye in the room tracking his movement. The medal was heavier than Cole had expected, its ribbon bright against the dark blue of the presentation case. As General Hayes pinned it to his civilian suit jacket, Cole felt the weight of 8 years of carefully maintained anonymity lifting from his shoulders. "There's something else," the general said quietly. "The Air Force would like to offer you a position as a test pilot instructor at Edwards. Full rank restoration, housing allowance. Works. We need people with your experience and judgment training the next generation. Edwards Air Force Base, the home of experimental flight testing, where the best pilots in the world pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the sky. It was the kind of opportunity Cole had dreamed about as a young lieutenant, the pinnacle of a military aviation career. "I appreciate the offer, ma'am," Cole heard himself saying, "but I have responsibilities in Denver, a son who needs his father to come home every night." The reception continued around them, but Cole felt increasingly disconnected from the conversations and celebrations. These people were honoring Phoenix, the pilot who'd performed an impossible rescue 8 years ago. But Phoenix was a memory now, a story told in military training academies and aviation museums. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Tommy's number appeared on the screen, and suddenly the noise and ceremony of the reception faded into background static. "Hey, buddy. How was school?" "Dad?" Tommy's voice was bright with excitement. "I finished my science project. Well, mostly. I still need help with the explanation part about how lift works. When are you coming home?" The simple question hit Cole like a punch to the chest. When was he coming home? To a small apartment that smelled like coffee and motor oil, to a kitchen table where he helped with homework every night, to a life that was ordinary and predictable and exactly what his son needed it to be. "Tomorrow morning, Tommy. I'll be on the first flight out." Cole's voice was steady, certain. "And we'll finish that project together, just like I promised." "Cool. Oh, and Dad, Mrs. Henderson said something weird today. She said she saw you on the news, something about airplanes and the military. But I told her that was impossible because you fix cars, not planes." Cole closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 8 years of careful lies pressing down on him. "We'll talk about it when I get home, okay? There are some things about your old man that you don't know yet. Good things or bad things? Just complicated things. But good, I think. Yeah, definitely good." The flight back to Denver the next morning was uneventful. No F-16 escorts or military ceremonies. Just a routine commercial flight filled with business travelers and tourists, people living ordinary lives that didn't require security clearances or classified briefings. The apartment felt smaller when Cole walked through the door, but it also felt safe, comfortable, predictable. Tommy burst through the door like a small hurricane, backpack flying behind him as he launched himself into Cole's arms. "Dad, you're back! Did you see any airplanes?" Cole caught his son and held him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of school playground and childhood energy. "I saw lots of airplanes, buddy. And yes, I got to go inside the Pentagon, but we need to talk about some things." They sat on the couch together, and Cole took a deep breath. You know how I've always told you that I used to have a different job before you came along? Tommy nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity of the moment. You said you were just trying to figure things out. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Cole felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Before you were born, I was in the Air Force. I was a pilot. The boy's eyes widened with excitement and confusion in equal measure. You were a pilot? Like you flew airplanes? Real ones? Fighter jets, actually. F-16s. My job was to fly missions and protect our country and help people who were in trouble. Cole watched his son's face, seeing the wonder and questions forming behind those bright brown eyes. I was pretty good at it. But why didn't you tell me? Tommy's voice carried a note of hurt that cut deeper than Cole had expected. I love airplanes. I've been doing my science project about how they fly, and you never said you actually knew how to fly them. Because sometimes when you love someone very much, you have to choose between the job you want and the life they need. When you came along, you needed a father who would be home every night, who would help with homework and make dinner and be there for soccer games. You didn't need a father who flew dangerous missions in faraway places. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness that children brought to life-changing revelations. Were you a good pilot? Yeah, buddy, I was a very good pilot. Good enough to be a hero? Cole thought about the ceremony, about the 200 passengers who'd gone home to their families 8 years ago because he'd refused to accept that some rescues were impossible. Sometimes being a hero just means doing your job when it really matters, and sometimes it means giving up the job you love for something more important. Like being my dad. Exactly like being my dad. They spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen table, Cole explaining the principles of flight with the kind of detailed knowledge that only came from thousands of hours in the cockpit. Tommy absorbed every word with the enthusiasm of a child discovering that his father possessed secret superpowers, asking questions that demonstrated a natural understanding of complex concepts. Dad? Tommy's voice interrupted his thoughts. Are you sad that you're not a pilot anymore? Cole looked around their small apartment with its familiar furniture and comfortable routines, thinking about the life they'd built together in Denver. Sometimes I miss the flying. I miss feeling like what I did mattered on a big scale. But then I look at you, and I remember that what I do now matters more than anything I ever did in the sky. Because I'm more important than flying. Because you're more important than anything in the world. 3 weeks later, Tommy approached him with a carefully folded piece of paper and an expression of nervous determination. Dad, I wrote you a letter, he announced. Mrs. Henderson said sometimes it's easier to write important things down instead of saying them out loud. Cole accepted the letter with the solemnity it deserved, unfolding it carefully to reveal his son's neat handwriting. Dear Dad, I know you gave up being a pilot to take care of me, and I want you to know that I think you made the right choice. Being my dad is the most important job in the world, and you're really good at it. But I also want you to know that I'm proud of you for being a hero before I was born. I hope someday I can be as brave as you. Maybe I'll be a pilot too, and then we can talk about flying together. I love you more than all the airplanes in the sky. Love, Tommy. Cole had to read the letter twice before he trusted his voice enough to respond. Thank you, buddy. This is the best letter anyone has ever written me. Really? Really? And you know what? If you want to be a pilot someday, I'll teach you everything I know about flying, but only if you promise to always remember that the most important job is taking care of the people you love. I promise, Dad. Can we start today? Cole looked out the window at the clear Colorado sky, then back at his son's eager face. For the first time in 8 years, the idea of sharing his aviation knowledge didn't feel like a betrayal of the life he'd chosen. It felt like a gift he could give to his son, a bridge between the past and the future that honored both Phoenix and Cole Mitchell. That afternoon, as they walked through the wings over the Rockies Air and Space Museum, Cole watched Tommy stare in wonder at the restored aircraft and detailed exhibits. Standing beside a restored F-16 Fighting Falcon, nearly identical to the aircraft Cole had once flown, Tommy reached out to touch the sleek fuselage with reverent fingers. "Did yours look just like this one, Dad?" "Almost exactly like this one," Cole confirmed. "Same engine, same wings, same cockpit layout. This is what I used to call home when I was up in the sky." "It's beautiful," Tommy breathed. "But I think I like our real home better." Cole smiled, understanding for the first time that his son had grasped something that had taken him 8 years to learn, that the most beautiful aircraft in the world was just a machine, but home was wherever your family was waiting for you to return safely. That night, as he tucked Tommy into bed, his son asked one final question that summarized everything Cole had been trying to understand about his own choices. "Dad, do you think Phoenix would be proud of the dad you became?" Cole considered the question seriously, thinking about the pilot he'd once been and the father he'd chosen to become. "I think Phoenix would understand that sometimes the most important mission is the one that never makes the news. Sometimes being a hero means giving up being a hero for something even more important." "Like being a dad?" "Exactly like being a dad." As Cole turned off the bedroom light and closed the door, he felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with medals or ceremonies or military recognition. He was still Phoenix, would always be Phoenix in the part of his heart that remembered the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of excellence in service to others. But he was also Cole Mitchell, single father and mechanic, whose greatest achievement wasn't saving 200 strangers, but raising one extraordinary little boy who understood that love was the most important mission of all. The sky would always remember Phoenix, but Cole Mitchell was building something even more lasting, a legacy of love and commitment that would outlive any military service record, a son who would grow up knowing without question that he was valued above all other priorities, and a life that proved that true heroism wasn't about how high you could fly, but how well you could love the people who mattered most. In the end, Phoenix hadn't been lost when he'd resigned his commission 8 years ago. Phoenix had simply evolved, trading a cockpit for a kitchen table, formation flying for bedtime stories, and military missions for the daily mission of being present, engaged, and devoted to the person who needed him most. And that mission, Cole knew with absolute certainty, was the most important flight of his life.